The following episode was originally recorded for a private podcast as part of the Equipped for Life course. It has been edited for public release, but may reference training material from the Equipped for Life course. So I'll get Google alerts when people talk about Eco Rights Institute online. And every once in a while, I'll kind of go through those and look for interesting things. A lot of it is just like people posted something on Facebook or Twitter or something like that. But there was an interesting thing that came up recently that I was like, ooh, this is a podcast topic right here. And Tim and Rachel have been done basically no prep for this because frankly, there's no prep needed. What happened, it was great. Someone posted Tim's Autumn in the Sovereign Zone article in a subreddit called Abortion Debate, which I didn't actually know. I'm subscribed to the pro-life subreddit. There's another pro-life subreddit. There's a pro-choice subreddit. There's an abortion subreddit, but there's also, it turns out, an abortion debate subreddit. So
maybe you need to like search the subreddits for like abortion and like, see these other things you're missing.
Yeah, seriously. So someone basically posts Tim's Autumn piece. And so in a moment, I'm going to have you just like summarize that piece just for the people who are not going to actually pause the podcast and go read the whole thing. Like I'm just going to basically want you to walk through it. Long. But they basically post the piece and are like, I'm interested in people's responses. Kind of even gave like, here's 3 specific questions. If people kind of agree with the conclusions of the article, how would you respond to these 3 questions? And a discussion ensues. And
let me interrupt for a second. So do you happen to know if the person who posted the article was pro-life or pro-choice?
I can't tell.
Okay.
And I wasn't willing to do enough like digging into his, like, what is his post history or her post history to find out. I don't know. There's clearly some pro-life and pro-choice people in this thread, which you can just kind of tell by what they're saying. There's some pro-life people trying and kind of failing to explain what a thought experiment is. But
so is that a great, super productive abortion debate area?
Well, I don't know. This is the only thread I've seen in the. Okay. I mean, it might be there's other. From what I gather from this, is probably not a very active sub. But to be fair, none of the abortion related subs on Reddit are active. Like the pro-life one, the pro-choice one, like none of them. Like frankly, none of them are that active. I post all of our stuff on the pro-life subreddit just because, and a lot of the mods over there like ERI and are glad to have our stuff, kind of there. And we do get some traffic from that subreddit. And more, I'm noticing people just casually mentioning ERI, which is a cool thing. So we're getting out there, and more people are referencing us just like casually as they're talking about the issue. But so here, it wasn't that active of a thread, but there's like, it's not a quality of comments. But it's not a quantity of comments, but there's like a quality. Like there's like long kind of like thoughtful or attempts at thoughtful responses. I don't want to be like overly charitable or overly harsh. Here's the thing.
They're trying.
Okay, so spoilers ahead. There's not great responses to this thing. But what I thought was interesting though was here are pro-choice people that, to their credit, read the paper or at least skimmed it and gave their best attempt at responding to it. And even if they're not great, like throwdown responses or like, oh man, Tim's like paper is like totally wrong. Like there's none of that in here. It still strikes me as like, here's a lot of probably the, pretty likely ways for pro-choice people to respond to this paper. And so our community is going to hear responses like this sometimes. And it would be good just to kind of, I'm just going to like pose these to you guys and just kind of have you react. How would you respond to a person if they said this to you, or kind of train people? Like if you hear this response to a pro-life counter argument to sovereign zone arguments, how should you respond to that? So Tim, why don't you kind of walk through the Autumn in the Sovereign Zone piece?
So the origin of the Autumn paper was, I was at JFA at the time at Justice for All and doing a lot of outreach and a lot of conversations about bodily rights. And as I kept on asking more and more clarification questions to find out whether or not they meant bodily rights or something else, and they always meant bodily rights, I had even more conversations about bodily rights. So I wound up in this spot where I just had this variety of different responses that I was inclined towards using. And I needed to spend some time kind of structuring what to do with all those responses. And there was some variety there. This paper was basically my attempt to first explain the clarification between sovereign zone and right to refuse, which is Trent Horn's clarification that we find really helpful. And then explain how I go about asking clarification questions to see whether or not people means bodily rights. And then going through basically 5 different arguments that respond to the sovereign zone view specifically. Some of those I got from other people. So the second one I got from Rich Papard at LTI. And the fourth one I got from Scott Klusendorf, but I think he said that he got it from somewhere else. Josh, do you remember?
Yeah. So the Yale art student thing, like there were a lot of pro-life people kind of making that kind of a connection. I don't know who got there first. I remember being like, I was at Georgia Right to Life at the time, like that actually happened. And there were a lot of Life news articles and things like that talking about it. So I don't know who got there first.
Yeah. In the paper, I credited Scott. At least I heard it from Scott.
Right. It's the best we can do sometimes.
Right. The arguments 1, 3, and 5 are things that I came up with, as far as I know anyway. So the first one being that you can't put restrictions on abortion if you're justifying it through bodily rights. That I've found to be increasingly helpful. The thalidomide is the second one, and then intentional thalidomide is the third one. And that was a development that came from like feeling like Rich Papard's thalidomide example was just really, really good, but we needed to push it stronger. I was using it on campus and it wasn't a hard enough bullet to bite. And so then I found if I'd say, well, if they're doing it intentionally, it was all of a sudden a much harder bullet to bite and it just worked a lot better. And then the last one is the fetal torture story, which I came up with like at dinner with Steve Wagner, where we were talking about the sovereign zone argument.
Super normal dinner conversation.
And I was just thinking about my experience in my philosophy degree, where like it's just very common in class to point to, well, the thing that's the most obvious is you can't torture babies for fun,
right? Or
torture toddlers for fun. It's like very standard kind of philosophy class thing.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, maybe the hardest bullet to possibly bite would be can you torture the fetus in the womb for fun if you wanted to, and if so, then like that'd be a response to the sovereign zone. So I mentioned that to Steve, and Steve thought for a second and said, I think you just killed the sovereign zone argument, which unfortunately Steve was wrong, because when I started using it, no one would bite that bullet. Nobody would bite that bullet. But then as time has passed and the pro-choice movement has become more extreme, there's a lot more of them that are just willing to say no exceptions. That I have unfortunately found some people who will bite that bullet, but initially at least it was very effective, and it's still useful in its own way. Yeah. So that's basically the autumn paper. Oh, and the other thing is I kind of took a try at creative writing and tried to explain these arguments in the context of a story of a woman named Autumn who's going through these different experiences. Not the most incredible creative writing in the world, but it was my attempt at it. So that's why it's called Autumn in the Sovereign Zone.
Well, what I was actually going to say, and I know it's a lot to ask of a podcast audience to go and like read a blog article, but I will say this paper by Tim is wonderful. The fact that you did it in a story format, I think gives the opportunity for us to hear Autumn's thoughts about the different abortion experiences and kind of stepping into the mind of like her rationalizing through them. I thought was brilliant because it not only helps us like have it sink in and digest the different thought experiments, but it helps us to think critically as we go. So it's carrying the new pro-lifer, and carrying you a little bit and giving you a little bit of a crutch to fall on if you don't really know how to think through how a pro-choice person would rationalize biting each bullet. So I thought it was brilliant. Cool. One of the best pro-life papers out there. So I'm excited to hear what this Reddit how it handles
before
it.
I get there, Tim, I want to ask you to do one more thing first. Sure. Like what you just did, I think was a really interesting kind of behind the scenes summary for the people who kind of already are tracking with the stuff. But given that some people maybe haven't watched the course module on this, or maybe haven't watched it in a long time, like, can you do like a 4 or 5 minute, just kind of walk through basically the arguments? You don't have to go through the whole story, every detail or something like that, but just like, I want people, if they've heard none of our stuff on bodily rights, to be able to track with the ensuing conversation. So I want a little bit more.
Okay. So I'll give as rapid fire as I can. The sovereign zone argument basically states that a woman's body is a sovereign zone. She can do anything she wants with anything inside her body. When you hear the phrase, my body, my choice, that's typically what they're talking about, although not always. This is pretty standard, very, very common pro-choice position. It's not the most academically defensible pro-choice bodily rights position, but in terms of lay people, this is oftentimes what they're going for. So Trent Horn calls that the sovereign zone view. So the way that we respond to it is by pointing out examples of things that if the sovereign zone view is true, would also be true, and that very much seem to not be true. So we got it's just a series of 5 examples of that. So the first one is, if you're justifying abortion through the sovereign zone view, or any other bodily rights view for that matter, you can't make restrictions on abortion. You have to be an extremist on abortion. There's no restrictions. You can have an abortion on your due date. You can have an abortion for sex selection reasons. You can do it for birth control, because all of these circumstances, while unpleasant, if your justification for abortion is, well, it's in my body, so it's my choice, that is still true even in all those other circumstances. As long as it is inside, you can kill it. You could argue, okay, well, what if it's halfway out? Okay, well, I guess maybe then it's unclear. But if it's all the way in, certainly if you're justifying abortion with a sovereign zone view, you can't make exceptions. And most pro-choice people, small is an increasingly smaller number, but still, certainly most pro-choice people think there should be some exceptions on abortion.
Yes.
So it's a really interesting dynamic where most people think there should be exceptions, and also most people use bodily rights arguments.
Right.
Yeah.
So pointing out that those things don't live together well is very, very effective. So that's the first thing, and I'll usually start there. And then the second one is the thalidomide argument. And the way this works is we reference the drug thalidomide, which a group of doctors gave to some pregnant women in the late 50s and early 60s to help them with their morning sickness. And while it did help them with their morning sickness, it also caused really severe birth defects. Babies born without arms and legs, like really, really serious stuff, really serious medical tragedy. So then the question is, what if a woman wanted to take thalidomide? If it's, my body, my choice, I can do anything I want with anything inside my body. Should she have the right to take thalidomide if she's having bad morning sickness? And this is, again, Rich Papard's argument. And this is pretty effective, but my usual experience using this argument is that people will get really uncomfortable, but still bite the bullet and say she should still have the right to do that. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't encourage her to do that, but it's her body, it's her choice. And then so the second version of the thalidomide argument, which would be the third argument in the series, is to say, what if she wanted to take thalidomide not because she's having bad morning sickness, but because she intentionally wanted to deform the baby?
Yeah.
And this response is one of the most persuasive tools that I've ever used on campus. It doesn't, like, some people will bite the bullet, but not most. And I think the reason for that is because the common pro-choice person has gone through a years-long process of rationalizing abortion. They tell themselves over and over, it's her body anyway. Maybe it's not even a baby. Like all these different things that they'll say, but they never go through a years-long process of justifying intentionally deforming a baby.
Yeah.
And so their moral compass points north, and they know that that's wrong, and that creates an incredibly powerful cognitive dissonance. So that's very, very effective. The fourth one, actually, I don't use so much anymore.
I was going to actually ask you about that today.
Yeah.
So that would make for a kind of an interesting, really quick discussion.
So the fourth one is based on a true story of a Yale art student named Eliza Schwarz, who had, I believe, multiple abortions and used the remains of those abortions for an art project. And this is just a very unpleasant thing. I think NARAL came out against her. Is like, this is too crass for us even. I'm not sure exactly who it was that came out against her, but it's a true story, so that makes it effective.
It's at least true that she claims that she did that. There's kind of like a question of, did she actually do it? But it certainly true that she claimed that she did it.
Yeah.
And so, for the sake of a thought experiment, I mean, certainly
just
someone
take her
could.
at her word.
And so that was typically what I would do for the fourth argument. And I've moved away from that primarily because I think it's messy with the sovereign zone concept. The sovereign zone is based on what you can do with something that's inside your body. And at this point, it's no longer inside her body. So I think the way you would make the argument is, if you still wanted to make the argument, is if she had an abortion intentionally because she wanted to use the remains for an art project, then she should still be allowed to have the abortion for that reason. And that is true. But whether or not, I think you could plausibly argue that it's just crass to use human body parts for art, and that at this point it's no longer inside her body, and so you could not bite the bullet on this and still hang on to the sovereign zone view. I just don't think it's as strong as the others. I think it's interesting and it's worth thinking about. So I'm not saying it's like unusable, but it's in a different category. And these days I don't use a series of 5 arguments on campus. Honestly, I just use a series of 4 and I skip this one.
Right, me too.
The fifth one is what I referred to earlier as the fetal torture story, or what you dubbed, Josh, years ago, Tim's really dark story.
It was on my PowerPoint and everything.
Yeah.
I needed there to be some kind of a light moment before I told this awful story.
Yeah. I don't tell it in most of my speeches because it's just so unpleasant. Like you can't come back from talking about this story. So bear with me, and kind of trigger warning. I typically give kind of a trigger warning here. Basically, the story is you imagine a woman and a man become sexually active, and they make an agreement that they won't have an abortion because he's very pro-life if they become pregnant. And then a little while later, they do become pregnant. And then not too long after that, she finds out that he has been cheating on her. And so out of vengeance, and I always clarify, I'm not saying this is what women are like or people that have abortions are like. That's not the point of the story. But hypothetically speaking, in this story, she becomes vengeful and she wants to punish him by punishing his baby. And so she finds an abortion doctor that's willing to help her with this and end this baby's life as painfully as possible. And so then the question is basically, is there a single, like one thing that she can't do to this baby as long as it's inside her body? If the sovereign zone view is true, then no, there is not a single thing that she can't do to this baby as long as it's inside her body. And that just seems obviously wrong. She could torture it in the third trimester. Like, it can clearly feel pain and like suffer incredibly. Like, there's no way that should be okay. But the way that most pro-choice people defend abortion allows for that example. So that one, I don't start there. Like, I only go there if I really, really have to.
Right.
And I often don't. And sometimes even depending on like the nature of the conversation, I won't go there even after they bite like the thalidomide bullets, because it's kind of an aggressive move. Like, you can be really nice about it, but if you're already having like a rough conversation and you go here, that's not going to be productive in most circumstances, I think.
Or if you're the pro-lifer who hears this and it's like, oh, this is like such a powerful argument. And it's like, this is like your opener. This is like, hi, hello, here's why I'm pro-life. Think about this story. And it's just like, it's just like the nuclear option. It's like, hold back.
I appreciate you bringing that up. I actually went through like some like personal struggles when I wrote this paper of whether or not to even publish this example. Because basically I felt like I'm just like handing grenades to people, just like putting grenades on the open market, and people are going to get hurt with this and people are going to use it really badly. And I'm going to be kind of culpable for that. And I don't think that's necessarily true, but I've really struggled with that. And I think basically my view right now is that what I'm handing you is a very sharp scalpel. And I'm urging you to use it the way a surgeon does and not the way like a murderer does or something. It's a powerful tool. And by that, I'm not being self-congratulatory. I mean, it has a strong effect on your conversation, whether good or bad. Right. And so use it very carefully, and don't use it if you don't like really need to.
It's the better opposite of like rhetorically subtle.
There's no coming back from it. And I've had conversations where I've used it and it has been very helpful and good because we have enough rapport that I can pull it off. This is not a move to pull off in the first 5 minutes of a conversation.
Right.
And it's not a move to pull off unless you've got the rapport to realistically manage it.
Like, what's going on for me, like when I use this, it's always last resort. It's like we've walked through and I'm just wanting so much for them to hear one of these first three examples and just move on. Go to right to refuse or abandon it and go to personhood. Like, that's what I'm wanting. I don't want to give terrible thought experiments, but it's kind of like I've had the experience, like before Tim wrote the paper and came up with this fetal torture story, I had experiences of walking through all four of these, because back then I was using the Yale Art story sometimes in my conversations, and they'd bite every bullet. And then basically I've got to give up. I've got to give up now. And I've just like invested like 45 minutes into this person and trying to be like, and like things are going well. We've got rapport, but it's just like, geez, it just seems like we can't find any common ground. And so now it's just like, no, there's just like one more thing I can try. And it's just like, if I get there, it's just like, man, why did you have to make me do this? Like here we are. And I will usually, if I feel like we do have the rapport, it's my one last ditch effort before giving up and kind of moving on to someone else. Because if we can't find common ground on this one, it's just like, I just don't know what we're doing here at this point. But for some people, not everybody, as you said, but for some people, this was the only bullet they could not bite.
Yes.
And this is the thing that gets them to move to a better argument. And so for some people, it's the perfect tool. Yeah. But yes, don't dangerous. Take it out right away. It's like,
and while we're on the topic, I'll give a couple more that aren't in the paper. So one of them is one that I learned recently from our teaching fellow, John Ferrer. I learned like a year ago. Great example, which is think like kind of like the fetal torture story, except what's happening is it's child sacrifice for like a satanic ritual.
Huh.
Should she legally have the right to do some gross ritual with the fetus? That's pretty rough. Also very extreme. And if you bring up satanic rituals, like hope your conversation survives it. But I think there's at least some potential there.
Huh. Like my gut instinct is that's better than the Yale Art story. Like it's doing something similar, but it's better because there's not this kind of easy way to get out of it. That's like, we shouldn't treat dead bodies that way, kind of a thing. Like this is
as long as it's inside her body,
right?
So I haven't used it on campus though. So that's one, and the other is I think there's like as I think more about the sovereign zone view, I think there's it's kind of a weird premise. to say that this is how the world works, that as long as it's inside your body, even if it's a human person, you can do whatever you want with it. It's kind of a simple view. So like, to give an analogy, Rachel and I have argued recently about libertarianism versus like conservatism.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things about libertarianism is that it's very simple. It's very elegant. It's really straightforward. It's like government stops people from aggressing each other, and that's it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's very simple. And there's something that's like attractive about that. But as I think about the sovereign zone principle, as long as it's in her body, she can do whatever she wants. I think it's not like, it has kind of a ring of simplicity, but it has a ring of ad hoc. Like, that's awfully convenient. That's a convenient way to defend
Mm-hmm.
abortion, especially given, I think most people don't function like that, which I think I would have to do more like experimentation with this to try to point out that like, well, why did you choose this principle, and try to like get them to defend why we should believe this in the first place, other than it justifies abortion and you're a feminist and you really like it or something like that. But I haven't done enough work on that yet.
Okay, that was super helpful. So now, having done that,
That's a lot of background.
let's get into this thread. No, it's
we
really
haven't
important.
done a significant.
We haven't talked about
thing on
sovereign
sovereign
stuff in a while. So I want to give you both permission this morning to just have a cathartic morning of, like, you know, the thing when like people who are like philosophical have to deal with people who are very, very not philosophical, straw manning good arguments. And it's like really frustrating. That's what this morning is going to be like for you. And just feel free to like be frustrated and annoyed and all those like feelings you're going to have. You don't have to suppress them all. It's okay. Generally, like we are very charitable, like in the way that like when we actually talk to pro-choice people, and even when we talk about like we're like on the extreme end of non-snarky generally, like on this podcast and stuff. I feel like in this case, having been the only one who's read this thread, I want to give us an exception where today we can be kind of snarky because there's some really bad responses to this. And I just think like this can either be a long kind of boring podcast, it's very philosophical, or we can kind of have some fun with it. And I just know that anyone who's try to talk about philosophy has dealt with people who don't get thought experiments, and it's so frustrating. And so I kind of want to let people like don't generally talk like this, but I just kind of I'm guessing that today we're going to be snarkier than usual by like a factor of 4, you know, something like that. And I'm going to say that's okay, but don't model that. Don't be like, don't like, if you actually deal with someone who doesn't understand what a thought experiment is with them, like, don't be super snarky with them. We're going to give you some ways to respond, but I just know I'm going to be reading these people's comments and they're not good. It's just like, so it's okay. Let's just have some fun. I'm interested in what your reaction is to these actual arguments. But first I'll read there's a quick original post, and just so you know what kind of people are reacting to.
Well, I'm excited to hear from this though, because so far what you've said happened in this subreddit is something that we're teaching with how to use social media. I know Reddit is a totally different beast than other social media.
Yes.
But it seems like they're presenting or using the tool in a way that we teach on our social media podcast, where
it's true.
Like, hey, I came across this thing. Here are some thoughts. I want to hear from you guys. Like, that's kind of how we teach to present something if you're going to post something. Yeah. So it sounds like we're off to a good start, but I'm interested to hear
the first post is good.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what they said though. I don't know if their questions were.
The original post is great.
Is it?
No, I think it's good. And I'm guessing actually, now reading this again, I'm guessing this is from a pro-life person because it starts with pro-choicers. So it seems like he's kind of saying, okay, to the other side, I'm posing this question.
Okay.
But again, it could come from either side, but anyway,
I guess if he was pro-choice, people more likely to say fellow pro-choicers.
Yeah.
But that's also like, that's a subtle, like an easy mistake to make.
Yeah.
I don't know.
We won't assume too much. But the person just says, pro-choicers, please read the 5 Years of Autumn story. He's got the link. It addresses bodily rights, and share your thoughts. And if you agree with the author's conclusion, how would you respond to these 3 questions at the end of the article? 1, why should a woman have the right to dismember a child if she shouldn't have the right to deform him? 2, why is it okay for her to have a doctor rip her child's limbs off with a suction machine or with forceps, but it is not okay for her to take a drug that causes her child to not grow limbs? And 3, why does she not have the right to cause her child to have a harder life, but she does have the right to deprive him of life completely? So there's kind of a negative in the fact that those questions are just posed there is like you have a lot of very helpful things in the paper that are like where you're really clearly saying this is not how I think pro-choice people are, like all these things. And none of that is happening here, which is like it probably got people like even if they then did read the link and kind of skim it, it is starting off on a pretty bad foot.
Yeah,
but
that's interesting. So, and that might be a good social media lesson in general. Like if you like everything about what he's doing here seems like he's like trying to be nice. Like, hey, here's the questions and like here's the article, but they're kind of inflammatory questions when they're isolated. So maybe that's not the best approach.
Right. Okay, so here is the first response from a pro-choice person. First off, your story contains the kind of caricatures of abortion providers that lead people to shoot us. That's the first response.
Ooh.
Well, that's. I guess things are inflamed sufficiently now. Okay, I guess now it is officially an online dialogue.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that person though? It's like real quick. Even before I go into further things, like it's important for pro-life people to often better understand than they do or take seriously what they do. Like the how it feels to be like an abortion practitioner who goes to work and actually has like some fear of that. How would you respond to the pro-choice person who's like, if you use an inflammatory thought experiment, like the fetal torture story, for example, like they're saying basically you doing that, it's like you're culpable now, or you're like, part of the chain of events that could lead to someone actually grabbing a gun and going to do something terrible. Like, how would you respond to that person?
So here's what I wouldn't say to them, but what I'll say to you is that's incredibly stupid for at least two significant reasons. The first is it's a thought experiment, bro. Like, give me a break. That's like saying because Thanos is a utilitarian, like the Marvel creators of the MCU are responsible for people getting angry with utilitarians and shooting them, or like doing things to Thanos that happened to Thanos in that movie. Like, oh, this is, I guess this is just what you're supposed to do to utilitarians. Like, that is bananas, ridiculous, stupid. It's one thing to, like, there's a certain kind of argument against instigating violence that is legitimate. And I'll address that again in a second here. There's a much more reasonable view that something like, hey, the Center for Medical Progress videos are so inflammatory and serious that the fact like someone becoming violent as a result of those, like that seems more like a causal kind of a thing. Right. I think that's at least like within the realm of the discussion. It happens to not be true, and I'll get to that in a second. Right. But saying because it's a thought experiment that's inflammatory, you're responsible for people killing actual real life abortion doctors? Okay, what if I got so mad at the music lovers in the violinist story that I go out and shoot actual music lovers? like
there's actually so a society of music lovers somewhere, and you're like, I'm so against you people.
Stupid.
How dare you kidnap people?
They're all like cowering in bunkers. They're like, thanks, Thompson.
It's just phenomenally stupid to suggest that. Like that's, I think, one of the stupidest things I've ever heard online.
Is it stupid?
It's really stupid. So that's the first one, and probably the more significant one. But the second one, I'd say read the paper that I wrote on the Planned Parenthood shooting, right? Which I walk through here. Like, how do we think about what it means to instigate violence? And so recently, Maxine Waters, a Democratic senator, is that right? Senator? Congresswoman, something like that.
I think like a California senator, but I'm not positive. I know she's in California.
Yeah. She's like encouraging people. You should go harass Trump supporters, like harass them on the street. And so when they do that, okay, like she's kind of culpable. She said, do this thing. Right. If you say a thing like, we are at war with white people, or that's not what she said, but like hypothetically, someone said, we're at war with white people, or we're at war with black people, or whatever. And then someone's like, oh, we're at war. And then they like go and knife them or something. Right. Like, well, you said a thing that's kind of like it's instigating that. And what I argued in the paper, in the blog post, which we should link to, is what it comes down to is whether or not the results, like the violent results, could reasonably be considered caused by the statement or something along those lines. And so, for instance, if someone says abortion is murder, like that's really serious. And so because of that, we really need to end abortion. And someone goes from that to, I guess I should just murder people, even though like every pro-life thinker in the universe says, no, you shouldn't respond to the problem of abortion by killing abortion practitioners. Right. That's an illogical conclusion. That's an unreasonable thing to take from that statement. Whereas if you say, man, if only someone was brave enough to murder all the abortion doctors. If you say something ridiculous like that, and then someone does it, well, that is a logical conclusion to take from that statement, and you have instigated violence. And so to say that I've instigated violence against pro-choice people with a thought experiment that doesn't in any way encourage violence, and given that it takes place on a website where at the footer of the website it says we oppose all abortion-related violence, like, give me a break.
Yeah.
Is that enough?
Yeah, I think that's enough.
Move on.
I'll just say the post that you're referring to is really worth reading. It's one of my favorite pieces that you've written, because I really like what you do. Like, it's like 6 different examples there, and there's this variety. I think it's really, really helpful. So because a lot of people, when this thing happens, like, connecting causality to these terrible things that happen is not like ought to be thought of as a nuanced thing. It's more complicated than people think, but then both sides will usually be saying these very simplistic things about causality, like in reaction to an abortion shooting or something like that.
Yeah.
And so a piece like this is just like adds more nuance than usually what people are doing. I just really like those pieces, so that's very good. All right, so this person moves on to quote one of the questions from the OP. Why does she not have the right to cause her child to have a harder life, but she does have the right to deprive him of life completely? Here's the answer. People can choose not to make a person and get a doctor's help in that. People can't choose to make worse people. They can, actually, and it's legal. To say it's not legal would be to say it's illegal not to take prenatal vitamins before starting a pregnancy. Imagine if Autumn wanted a child with a neural tube defect and thus chose to not take prenatal vitamins, but they can't get a doctor's help in that. Why do I think that's the case? Simple. I think that the fetus does not have ethical standing in the case because I don't believe in fetal personhood. I think the fetus lacks ethical standing because it doesn't have the conscious properties of a person. Hopes, dreams, fears, etc. The pregnant person has ethical standing. They have a compelling interest in not being pregnant when they don't want to be. However, if the pregnancy is going to continue and be born, then the child has ethical standing.
So if you want to say this, that's fine, but just don't appeal to bodily rights. Bodily rights isn't doing anything for you. You're saying it's not a person. That's reason enough to say you can kill it. All right?
Like, just the way that they are wording their post makes me think that this is a person who is typing and then hit send and like didn't read back.
Right.
Like everything
They didn't read the article.
Didn't read the article. Everything is so confusing. I was like trying to understand with the legal versus the illegal. I'm like, I don't know what they're trying to say.
So, a couple other things. It's saying you have the right to stop a person from coming into existence. Well,
yeah,
it's kind of the central premise behind the bodily rights argument.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not the unborn is a person doesn't matter for the bodily rights argument. That's Thompson's whole point in the violinist story. Even though it's uncontroversial that the violinist is a person, that doesn't mean that you should be forced to use your body to support him. So if you want to just say it's not a person yet, and so we can stop from existing, fine, again. But then you don't need a bodily rights argument.
Right.
And the prenatal vitamin thing.
That's just bad science.
Well, so there's some bad science there, but I think I understand the argument that he's trying to make is like, well, then what would the implications of that be? Can you force her to do this and that, and can you imprison her for not using prenatal vitamins? In which case, I would say it's pretty reasonable to imprison a parent for clubbing their baby with a sledgehammer, and it's different to imprison them for not giving their baby vitamins.
Mm-hmm.
Like, those are obviously different things.
Yeah.
And whatever a society should do about protecting children and giving them good vitamins and stuff, whatever that is, just probably minimal given we're talking about vitamins and not like critical healthcare. Like if they wouldn't give a diabetic child insulin, okay.
Yeah.
Let's do something about that.
Right.
You're not giving them vitamins. Is okay, well, there we can just conflate that with removing their legs or killing them. Give me a break.
It's such a weak, slippery slope straw man argument, like all rolled into one. But it's the kind of thing that we're seeing a lot now, like with the people that are, now that people are kind of freaking out about Roe and Casey being overturned. It's like we're seeing a lot of these things. Well, here's if A happens, then clearly Z is going to happen. I'm like, there's 24 letters in between. like maybe, but also very plausibly not. And let's have those conversations. This is also why it's really important for pro-life people to remember that people who make bodily rights arguments usually also don't believe it's a person too. Like they've got both going on, and that's a pattern in this thread. They're not just doing the bodily rights thing and treating this as just a bodily rights argument and this kind of table personhood. It's like they can't compartmentalize between these two things, and that's causing a lot of bad thinking.
So even though that this poster is really annoying, I need to make a plug for if in your conversations in person, the pro-choice person brings up something like prenatal vitamins. Maybe they just got done watching Handmaid's Tale season 2. They're all hyped up and they say to the pro-lifer, well, do you think we should be forcing women to take prenatal vitamins? What they really mean when they are asking something like that, even if it seems really absurd, they're trying to figure out, do you have any limits on how much you want to like force women to do? They may be saying it in a really inflammatory, hostile, stupid way. That's really annoying. But they're trying to get to the bottom of the limits, and they're trying to find common ground, even if they're doing it the wrong way.
Yep. And we should respond by saying we're not trying to force anybody to do specific positive things. We're trying to force them to not murder babies. Like that's a very big difference. I know that's like a harsh way of saying it, and the word murder is sketchy there because it's a legal term. Right. But like at a rhetorical level here, I think it's actually somewhat helpful. There's a huge difference between saying you need to give your baby 10 chocolates a day. Like you got to do these things. You got to they need to have their own room, or you need to make this much money or give them this much allowance. All of these things we're doing for them and saying you can't kill them. These are different in kind things. Yeah.
And this sort of argument is going to come up more and more as things get more divisive. And so I will plug once again Tim's piece on pro-lifers are not forcing women to stay pregnant. We have to link that again. If you have not read that piece, you need to read that piece. This sort of, you're forcing women, back alley abortion, all of these like Handmaid's Tale, fear-mongering things are coming at the pro-choice movement hard. And the lay pro-choice person is getting swept up in them. And so it's going to come up in conversations more and more.
Like anytime someone on social media says pro-lifers are forcing women to be pregnant, like you should link this piece.
Yeah.
Like every time.
Okay, so this next person comments, and there was a pro-life person who briefly responds to him, and this person, him or her, I don't know, and then this person like kind of adds another one, and in the follow-up response, there's a really weird sentence that's like shows that this person I think is very confused. But anyway, here's kind of the first response. I personally am a pre-personhood pro-choicer, not bodily autonomy. So I'm like,
a pre-personhood pro-choicer.
Yeah, I think just doesn't believe that fetuses have personhood, as opposed to being a bodily autonomy type of pro-choice person.
So, like embryos are pre-personhood.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's what they're trying to say. But it's like as soon as I saw that, I'm like, hey, when am I going to see a pro-choice person who's actually like a bodily rights person respond to this bodily rights favor? But anyway, it's like, so I'm also a person. For reasons I posted elsewhere, I believe a conscious human brain is a necessary condition for being a human being. As such, I am only posting to assure people that yes, when I say that I don't believe the fetus is a human being, that is exactly what I mean. Not that it is a human being, but is okay to kill it because it is in the pregnant woman's body. I know the author isn't saying we don't exist, but it comes off as kind of dismissive of the position. It's just like,
no, it's not.
No, not at all.
Read the paper.
So the pro-life person responds for asking some clarification. This is pretty helpful, I think. He says, I assume that when you say human being, you mean person, right? I think almost everyone agrees that the unborn is a living organism that is biologically human. I've come to have some respect for pre-personhood pro-choicers, as you say. I think personhood is harder to argue about than bodily rights, but sometimes bodily rights pro-choicers scare me with their fervor for the quote-unquote right to kill what they admit, at least for the sake of argument, is a person. Okay, so then the pro-choice person responds, and this is where it gets really interesting.
That's a good response from the pro-life person.
It's really not bad so far.
Yeah. I guess I kind of mean both. I've always thought of human being and human person as being synonymous, and I don't think something being a human organism is a sufficient condition for being either, though it is sufficient condition for being a member of the human species and thus a Homo sapien. I know this seems odd, but the short of it is I don't believe human persons are anything more or anything less than a conscious human brain, and as such, I believe we are all just a part of a human organism, and thus only a part of a member of the human species, which is to say, I am not a human organism per se.
So what he means by human organism is very
Yes.
different than what the rest of planet Earth means by human organism. If you have a definition of a term that only you use ever, maybe you should conform to the rest of us. Like, find a different way to describe it.
If you're a pro-choice person who has to end up concluding with, I am not a human organism, probably there's something wrong that happened before you got to that point, that conclusion. So the person goes on to say, as such, Homo sapien, human organism, and member of the human species are all synonymous, but none of those are synonymous with human being or human person by my reckoning. I explained my reasoning in the thread on When Does Life Begin if you want a slightly more in-depth explanation. And yeah, I find the bodily autonomy argument a bit off-putting too. I mean, there is an argument to be made. I just don't think it is as strong as the argument against it. Okay, so what would you say to the person, or what else would you, how else would you respond to this person if they're trying to say, something along these lines of, I don't think the fetus is a person, but I do think that we're all kind of part of this one big human organism, and that's why definitely fetuses aren't human organisms, and all this kind of, What would you do with this person?
Trying to be as charitable as possible. Okay, so here's what I'm taking away from their comment. When they say human being, they're conflating that term with a person, which is, I think, okay. Like, I think a lot of people...
it's not unheard of.
It's not unheard of. Like, in the lay community, they just think human being, person,
Yeah.
where, like, human being is different than Homo sapien. And I think that's okay.
Right.
And they're not ridiculous for having that. When they say something like the human organism thing, maybe trying to be charitable, maybe they're talking about the, like, collective mind of the human family thing, which I know is a fringe view, but some people have that where they think at a metaphysical, spiritual level that, like, all of the human race is kind of connected, and there's different theories out there about, like, inventions and hive minds and things like that. I don't know if you've heard of this. I think it's pretty fringe, but maybe that's what they mean. I'm not sure.
It sort of feels like the person means. I think there is something like that. There's some kind of a collective or society or something. We're all kind of one in some circumstance, and they're using whatever that one is, that hive mind or whatever. They're defining that as organism.
Yeah.
And then responding pro-lifer is saying fetuses aren't organisms, and I am not an organism. I'm just part of this larger organism.
And
I'm not sure. Like, I think there's a way to understand what the Reddit guy is saying without any kind of weird hive mind stuff. It's just like, this is just how I think about humanity. Like, we're all kind of together, and we're all part of one connected family, and he calls it an organism, like that kind of thing. Maybe. I'm just not sure.
And so I wouldn't argue with them about that because I don't really care about that necessarily.
Sure.
I think what I would do is thank them for being intellectually honest, because they admit there's a bodily rights argument out there to be made, but it's not as great as its responses.
Right.
And I would say, I am really glad that you are, willing to say that. Let's put aside all of the bodily rights stuff and let's talk about personhood. And I would use the equal rights argument with them and see how that goes. Did they say consciousness is kind of their criteria for...
So, like, a conscious human brain. I think
conscious human brain.
It's nothing more and nothing less than a conscious human brain. That is what personhood is.
Yeah, and so I would totally talk about that with them. I think that was pretty clear.
I agree with Rachel. I think find common ground. Sounds like they basically agree on that the bodily rights stuff isn't very strong. I maybe clarify. So then, if there was a pro-choice bodily rights person standing here talking with us, you guys would be on the same team against me about whether abortion should be legal, but would you be on the same team with me against them about whether or not bodily rights justifies abortion? Just to clarify.
Yeah, and that's always a really good question to ask, I think.
And so I, start the common ground. Don't argue with them about the organism stuff. You're like, well, so it sounds like you're using terms a little bit differently. So maybe define terms a little bit in a different way. Say, okay, so when could we just, for the sake of our conversation, say that what you mean by organism, let's call it a superorganism.
Yeah.
And what I mean by organism, we'll call that organism. Not try to be like preferential towards me or something. It's just like, I don't know what else to do.
So like me and all the
Yeah.
experts of the biological community, when we say organism,
that's not what I was suggesting. But to say like there's some kind of usefulness to how most people use the word organism.
Right.
We're talking
Yeah.
about a certain kind of individual entity, whether or not it's completely metaphysically individual is irrelevant to that question. Like there's something here. Do we agree that it's a member of the human species and in that sense an organism? And just like define terms a little bit, but
Right.
basically find common ground. Don't argue about superorganisms,
Mhm.
and talk about personhood.
If whenever you talk about like what we mean by organism is like if they want you to use the phrase biological organism, fine, I'll say biological organism. Like as long as we understand what we both mean by the same term, then
Sure.
we can move on. All right. So this person, their user,
It's a different person.
yeah, this is a different person. Their username is I always hated Reddit, which is ironic because they really hated your article. So here's this person. This is kind of
Oh,
interesting
gee.
because after ranting about how awful your article is, does X respond to all three questions? And so there's a lot of clarity here. But
Fun.
man, this is someone typing with like steam coming out the ears, like not happy.
yay.
That whole article sat with me wrong. It was a caricature. It reminded me of the videos I've seen of those highly religious haunted houses where Satan is like performing abortions and every situation is dramatized to the absolute max.
It's a thought experiment.
Why is Autumn?
What videos?
It's like
It's just what a thought
there's
experiment
actually a
is.
YouTube link the person links
No.
to. I won't link
The
to it.
weird
But
part of YouTube. Oh
yeah,
gosh.
there are pretty cringy Christian haunted house things like that does happen.
I've
get
never
it.
heard of that.
That's
sounds
a
funny.
thing. It's like
Oh, gosh.
a big church will like take over like a floor of their church and like set it up as their kind of religious haunted house, and it's like
So
trying
like
to get
what,
all the kids in the
Democrats pop out
neighborhood.
at you? Like what is a religious haunted
That
house?
that kind of thing, that kind of a
Or,
caricature,
like
but it's not like
prostitutes, maybe like
it's like, I mean, it's still going to be really gory. So it's like,
okay,
you know,
like demons.
abortion is, there's usually an abortion room. There's usually, you know, it's just like, what are the worst possible things that could happen to you if you don't do what your parents say or follow
Oh.
God?
Oh,
If people
no.
being, you know, kidnapped and tortured, and it's like things like that. And at the end, there's usually people there that are ready to talk to you about Jesus Christ and joining the church and things like that. Like this is a thing. This is a thing. And I'm sure there's some churches that do it better than
hurts.
others.
It hurts.
I'm sure there are churches that do it in ways that are not as cringy as what I just described. What I've described is a thing that happens, and I've
What you
seen
described
videos.
is not cool.
So I don't know enough about the churches that maybe do it way better than you described, but it makes me really uncomfortable. Let's move on.
Okay. Why is Autumn taking thalidomide when there's so many other alternatives?
Oh my gosh.
B6 and Unisum are available over the counter and supposedly pretty effective. Why is he taking illegally obtained thalidomide instead of a legally obtained prescription
Doesn't
that
matter.
doesn't cause deformity?
Doesn't matter. It's a thought experiment.
This is
Suppose that they're not available. This is what she has available.
This is greatly illogical. Why shouldn't
Nope.
she terminate a disabled
Wrong.
child?
Wrong.
Wrong.
I have the greatest argument.
I'm not going to be able to get through this. Why wouldn't she terminate a disabled child, but she would terminate a child for being the wrong gender or because she had a breakup or for an art project?
Who knows?
That's very inconsistent.
People are inconsistent.
Abortionists will often not perform an abortion as late as 35 weeks without a damn good reason.
Yeah, a lot of them do. Yeah, the thought experiment is she found one who's willing. That's called a thought experiment, friend.
How does she find an abortionist who
I
will
don't
do
know.
whatever she
Doesn't
wants
matter.
on a whim?
Doesn't matter. Family friend. Put out an ad. Doesn't matter. Matters nothing.
You need to just let Josh get through it.
No, it's okay. Abortionists perform abortions for the good of society, not because they're sadistic basket cases.
Well, there's Gosnell, and whatever the person's motivations are isn't the issue.
The most outrageous part of the entire scenario is the part where the abortionist tortures the 38-week fetus. That is so absolutely ludicrous. Didn't spell ludicrous, right? Why would a medical professional do that? Why would the doctor?
Because he wanted to take care of the woman.
Why would the doctor waste their time seeking revenge on someone they don't even know?
Why
Is-
do doctors shred babies? It's weird to me too.
Is the abortionist actually the devil? Is he supposed to portray
I
a
guess.
typical abortion doctor?
I didn't specify that in my thought experiment, but I suppose I could if that would make it easier for you.
If you have to use the most ridiculous, unbelievable arguments that aren't even based in the real world, how can anyone
is the
take
violinist.
that seriously?
Neither is the violinist. It's imaginable. It's fair game.
Did the article really dismantle the sovereign zone argument if it had to make up absolutely insane stories to back it up?
That's what thought experiments are. Like, is anybody familiar with thought experiments? What is that?
It doesn't feel like the person is. No, doesn't really feel
Like, take
like.
a philosophy class. This is every philosophy class is playing with thought experiments to try to figure out principles.
Okay, so if you were so let's get practical for a second, because there's a lot of people that don't take philosophy classes, but they respond like it's really frustrating when people respond to thought experiments like this. And a lot of our listeners are going to be in that situation, and there's got to be something more helpful we can give them than telling them go take a philosophy class and then talk to me. How would you, if you had to summarize in a minute or two to someone who's like, maybe not quite this, like, this is a closed-minded person, but like if you're talking to an open-minded person that just like isn't getting the value of thought experiments, how would you recommend someone if you can like kind of role play that out?
So that's not the norm for, well, if I'm going to argue about whether or not thought experiments are legitimate, I'm usually talking to someone who's being a jerk, just being really stubborn. So the first thing that I might ask is something like, so I'm not sure how familiar you are with the discipline of philosophy. It's not intended as rude or something. But in the discipline of philosophy, this is just very standard to use imaginable stories to try to get to principles. And so if this concept is not legitimate, we basically have to toss most of the discipline of philosophy. And so are you comfortable, or how confident are you that we should do that, given that you're not a PhD in philosophy and there are a lot of PhDs in philosophy who have studied this a lot and think otherwise? Like, are you that ready to just throw out the discipline? Like, I'm not an astronomer. I don't know how they do the stuff they do. I'm not ready to toss it out. Like, that just like feels arrogant to me. Right. Like, how confident are you that this is what we should do? And if they're just honestly asking questions because they're honestly confused, right, then cool. I could say something like, so there's an episode of 30 Rock that's pretty funny, where there's like the dumb Page, rejects the thought experiment of like, okay, but what if there's there's a small number of people, you can only save one. What do you do? He's like, oh, that I don't answer questions like that. That's that's playing tricks on your brain. It's really funny. And then it bothers the Alec Baldwin character so much. He like actually stages the elevator actually closes. Like, all right, so what are we going to do, Kenneth? There's only enough air for, this many of us. And there's a gun with one bullet. How do we figure out what to do? And Kenneth just puts the gun to his head and pulls the trigger. But there's no gun, no bullet in the gun. Right. And it just like irritates him. So it's funny. The point is like the fact that we're using a thought experiment doesn't mean it might not happen. And so if it might happen, then it's good to think about what we should do about it. There are no aliens that have landed on Earth, but it's possible they did. So a question that like C.S. Lewis asked, like, well, what should we do? How should we think spiritually about aliens if they showed up? Right. Is a perfectly fair question because it could happen. The violinist story is fair because it's perfectly plausible. Like literally in our lifetimes, that technology could exist. And so we can ask now, even though it doesn't exist yet, how we should think about that. So we're prepared. Like there's nothing unreasonable about that. Right. There's a lot of stories we can come up with that could like absolutely happen today. And the fact that they just happen to have not doesn't matter. And that's just the things like the trolley. It's very plausible that a trolley could be going down a track and either it's going to crush 5 people on the track or you can throw a fat man in front of it and it'll just kill the fat man. Like, I don't think that's ever happened. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure it's never happened. But there's nothing in that story that's sci-fi or weird or impossible. Right. It's a thing that could happen. A person could be struggling with this question of, man, there's that fat man there. I could just push him off and then only one person would die instead of 5. Should I do that? That is legitimately a question that someone could ask themselves. Right. And so given that we can imagine that, let's talk about it. What should we do if, God forbid, we're in that kind of situation? And if they are still like, nope, it doesn't count because it's not real. They're like, maybe I'd say something like, it's people like you that encourage weird serial killers to do crazy things to then make it real. That's just me being a jerk.
So
Don't say that.
I wouldn't actually say that, but that's what I would feel like saying.
So I think Tim's style of like throwing the discipline at philosophy, like either out the window or you keep it in and we get to do the thought experiment, is one angle. I'm going to offer kind of the Rachel style version of it,
Sure.
which is way less academic and a little bit more. I want to like, if they're not being the annoying person, they're just actually confused or not tracking well.
And for clarity, just for a second, if they're being annoying about this, I'm out of there real fast. Okay, like I'm not staying in that conversation long.
I'll
if they're being a
link to
jerk.
the article on when and how to graciously end conversations. You might want to.
That's one of them.
Yeah. So
Keep going, Rachel.
this is the version for when it's like a genuine person and they're just not tracking. I'll say something along the lines of, so like these stories called thought experiments are tools which we use. They're not real and they don't have to be realistic, but they're a tool that we can use to isolate a problem. So we're only thinking about one thing at a time.
Yeah.
And it's allowing our common sense to come in, our intuition to come in. And so we can struggle with the one thing at a time. And you want to think about it like a scientific experiment, right? In like the Petri dish scenario, there's not all the external things going on because they're trying to do one variable at a time. And so that's the same thing
really
I'm trying to do right now, just with something like a moral issue.
Yeah, that's great. And so to bounce off that a little further, so think about like the thought experiment. Okay, so the Nazis are at your door and you're hiding Jews,
Right.
And they say, "Are you hiding Jews?" What do you say? So there are certain people that are like, you never lie, and so you're just silent or something. You just don't say anything, and that makes it difficult to then answer the question that the thought experiment is trying to get to, which is whether or not it's ever okay to lie.
Right.
And so if that's what you're trying to get to, what you then will do is you try to isolate all those other variables and say, okay, you don't have any other options. You like try to remove all the other variables. You happen to know that these Nazis are very, very smart,
right?
And they can tell if you're being evasive,
right?
And they will immediately search your house and find the Jews. Okay. Now that's the situation. Now let's ask the question again. It's like you try to structure this scenario in a way where you only end up with a couple of options. So then you can actually try to figure out what you're trying to figure out.
Right. Like in the real world, usually you know way less than you do in a thought experiment.
Right.
But there's a reason for this is that makes things, yes, naturally unclear, but like we don't want that like, oh, well, how does the person know about these different things? Like we don't want that to just like stop everything. It's just like, oh, this is pretend like you know all these different things.
Isolate it down to a few things so we can try to answer the question we're trying to answer.
And I can speak from the like previous little annoying sister. Like when I was really little, my brother would like ask me like thought experiment questions. I didn't know they were thought experiments at the time, but I was like, unfortunately, like unusually innovative, and I would always try to come up with a third option. The third option.
You're the obnoxious person in the philosophy class. Is like, I don't know, maybe we could do this.
But like,
what if there was a portal out of there?
This is not like the philosophy class.
Maybe I'm the Hulk and I can just stop the train. I can stop the trolley and no one has to die. No, you're not the Hulk.
Right? No, like I was like in the back seat of the car on the long road trip. Like, but what if I had like a gun and I can shoot the Nazis over and like that was me trying to be helpful. And David would always say, no, you have to pick one of the two. Like poor David, but like
That's
I was
so funny.
trying my best. I thought it was like that was what I was supposed to do, is come up with another solution.
No, that's not what you're supposed to do.
So if you encounter
That's
me
funny.
on a college campus.
So that might actually be an interesting like insight, is if they're trying to be difficult, maybe they're not actually trying to be difficult. Like they think that there's a different thing that they're supposed to be doing in the situation.
Yeah.
And so giving some of the explanation of what we're doing here might be helpful.
It's like the person
so
who
funny.
goes to an escape room who thinks they're being innovative by like unscrewing like the light fixtures and like all the things they're not supposed to do in an escape room. Like they tell you there's certain things you're not
I
supposed
brought
to do.
an axe with me. We're getting out of here.
I'm innovative. No, you're
not playing by the rules.
Right.
To be fair, I was in like elementary school. Okay.
Yeah.
You were doing pretty good for an elementary school student. There's no judgment and brainstorming. But there's also, just as a reminder, there's also a reason why sometimes these thought experiments get really extreme. And it goes back to that thing that Rachel said earlier. It's like sometimes you're trying to just find the boundaries of someone's belief, and that's okay. It's just like hard because sometimes for someone, especially if there's not a lot of rapport, it feels like this really rhetorically like aggressive thing to do. It's like, why are you talking about it? It's like horrible story. It's like, well, I'm trying to find, do you have any limits on abortion? I'm trying to because I haven't found that yet.
Right.
And this is kind of a process of trying to, and it's fine for them to do that to us. It's fine for them to ask, so are you saying that condoms should be illegal because you apparently think sperm are sacred? There's all these different things that it's totally fine for them to ask. It might be ignorant. It might be they just totally strawman Catholic theology just now, but it's fine for them to ask these questions and for us to do our best to answer them. But yeah, these thought experiments sometimes get extreme because you're trying to find the boundaries.
And another example of a time where the other side will push us would be something like, okay, well, what if she's raped and she's 7 and she's pregnant? It's an abusive environment. They just kind of stack things one on top of the other.
Right.
That kind of situation. What they're trying to do, sometimes they're trying to be jerks. But what an intellectually honest person who's asking that kind of question is trying to do is trying to say, okay, is there a line somewhere?
Right.
Is there some kind of a situation where you would be okay with abortion?
Right.
If they're doing that, trying to treat it like a thought experiment can be helpful and say, okay, I think that rape is not a good reason for abortion. Life of the mother is. Right. And so if she's going to die, I'm with you. She can have the abortion or she can have some kind of procedure to save her life. That might be a helpful clarification for them because what they're trying to do is they're trying to find a line.
Right. I've probably told this story before, but just real quick, because I dealt with a pro-choice person who tried to ban all thought experiments from the conversation because we were going back and forth. It was in that abortion debate group that I got into, and that kind of got me on the track of thinking about relational apologetics. And there's this one person, Kara. I'll never forget Kara. She was so obnoxious. That's totally her name, and there's no way she's listening to this podcast. Whatever. She's totally publicly in this big abortion debate group, and every time we would say a thing, she'd just respond with bodily autonomy trumps right to life, and that's the only things he would say. So I finally tried to engage her, and I tried it. I'm doing bodily rights kind of thought it because she's a totally bodily rights person. So I'm giving her bodily rights, and she's like, no thought experiments allowed. And I'm like, wait a minute, you don't want to make that rule. That rule is not that's actually going to benefit me. Some of the best arguments your side has to offer are in thought experiments. I don't have to use thought experiments. I think it's good. I think thought experiments are really useful, but that rule that you think is going to be great for you because you don't like that I just asked you a hard thought experiment that's not a rule that you want to make. Anyway. I'll move on. So the commenter, I'll go back just a little bit. So the commenter says, if you have to use the most ridiculous, unbelievable arguments that aren't even based in the real world, how can anyone take that seriously? Did the article really dismantle the sovereign zone argument if it had to make up absolutely insane stories to back it up?
Thought experiment.
But to answer the 3 questions asked, okay, so question 1, why should a woman have the right to dismember a child if she shouldn't have the right to deform him? Because termination is good for society and purposely deforming them isn't.
Okay, so you're a utilitarian also. So if I give you a situation where terminating born babies is good for society, then you would bite the bullet, yes?
You're not allowed to use thought experiments. It's so ridiculous. That would never happen.
Yeah, whatever.
I'm guessing that's what the person would say. And then question 2. Why is it okay for her to have a doctor rip her child's limbs off with a suction machine or with forceps, but it's not okay for her to take a drug that causes her child to not grow limbs? Because termination is good for society and intentionally bringing deformed children into the world isn't.
So you're a utilitarian. Okay.
And then question 3, why does she not have the right to cause her child to have a harder life, but she does have the right to deprive him of life completely? Women do have the right to cause their children harder lives. There's no law against doing drugs while you're pregnant. There is no law that says you have to pick a good partner who won't abuse your children. There is no law that says women have to be good enough parents before they have children.
Yeah, so I covered all these things.
Yeah. So
there are laws that say you can't rip your baby's arms off. Not sure exactly what that law would be. What, assault or something? I'm not sure exactly what it is. You definitely can't do it. It's abuse. And that doesn't mean that you have to take a test to see whether or not you're good enough to be a parent. There's a presumption of innocence and responsibility on parents. We don't assume that a given parent is a terrible parent and police them and surveil them and monitor them until they prove otherwise. We assume they're fine. Unless we see evidence of the contrary. The fact that people don't need to have tests in order to be parents doesn't mean that then you can just do whatever you want with your kid. It's a very, very silly argument.
Yeah. So there are a few pro-life people who jumped in and tried to explain to the group, into the room. Here's what thought experiments are. Like there's also really
God
helpfully,
bless them.
really helpfully, there was a pro-life person who actually like copied and pasted like your kind of common groundy thing toward the top of your article. That's like, I don't think this is what pro-choice people are like, and blah, blah, blah. He's like, just so everyone knows, and just like posted that. So that guy, good on him.
Gold star.
So he goes so someone else goes to try to explain a little bit about thought experiments. And I'll just read that because that person, that annoying person we were just reading, responds to it. So this is kind of interesting because like this person kind of summarizes a lot of what you're saying, and we get to actually see the person respond. So I'll just kind of read the pro-life person says, I agree that the story is unusual. However, many thought experiments are. After all, I think the pro-choice bodily autonomy argument originally came from, or was at least popularized by, a strange scenario where you're kidnapped overnight by some psychopath weirdos who are somehow able to enter a hospital, access and use various machinery, miraculously hook you up to a famous stranger to save her life, and apparently you'll remain there for 9 months without hospital staff or the police interrupting. And there's many other famous thought experiments that are ridiculous and unbelievable, like the burning building scenario, save 100 embryos or 1 child.
Yep.
Thought experiments are beneficial for moral debates because they can help us recognize a general principle and apply that to other topics. So saying this is insane doesn't dismiss their validity. And then I always hated Reddit person says, I know what a thought experiment is, and I don't think they usually delve into territory that is quite so ridiculous. I also don't think that's where the bodily autonomy argument comes from.
So just for clarity, thought experiments are only okay if you like them. That's what I heard.
I believe in bodily autonomy, and yet I've never heard of the scenario you're talking about. And I still have a hard time. They haven't heard of the violinist. That's what this person just said. And I still have a hard time understanding how this would sway someone. There's no such thing as an autumn. Nobody is getting abortions just for funsies. Nobody is getting abortions with the intention of being as strange and twisted as possible. Abortionists aren't torturing term fetuses for the hell of it.
It's a thought experiment.
And then someone responds to be the devil's advocate. It does happen. And it's a link to a Guardian article about a woman who did a self-abortion on her 40-week fetus. Like basically poisoned her fetus herself.
That's gross.
And then the person responds, it doesn't sound like she was trying to torture the fetus. And there is also no doctor involvement. In fact, the article only says that she took a drug to induce labor.
About the thought experiment.
Yeah, it's just like, the person's like, didn't really read the article, is straw manning the article, and it just kind of goes from there. So,
the fact that they said there's no such thing as an autumn or something tells me they didn't read the article.
Yeah.
Autumn is a person.
Autumn is the name of the person in the thought experiment. Yeah. There's no such thing as an autumn.
I don't think that's what it is. I think this might be the only commenter that actually read the article. Because the person referenced a lot from the article. I think that this might be the only commenter that did read the article. I think the person's like using grammar weird there, but like it's this whole thing.
Oh, he means it's not a real person.
Right. Okay. I think that's what the person, because it's like, I don't think it and went through like all of those examples. At one point, the person also says like no one would do art projects, like, but it didn't happen that. But it's just to say like that experiment, that thought experiment never happens. That thought experiment never happens. That thought experiment never happens. That's what the person is saying. I think they actually at least skimmed the article and it just doesn't understand about that. And someone else, by the way, is like, wait, you seriously never heard of Thompson's violinist? It's one of the most cited thought experiments in the abortion debate.
So I have a thought. I think a lot of times there is something to be said for people on the left in general, but especially people who are very pro-choice. They care about what is actually happening and what is real.
Yeah.
And so while I think this person is being very ridiculous, there is something that's similar in kind of their stubbornness on this is never happening, this isn't going on, where they see conservatives and people on the right as idealistic. And they see, well, yeah, in a perfect world, we wouldn't need abortion.
Right.
And we could end abortion. We could have all these resources and we could have all this birth control and all of this would just work out. But take off your rose-colored glasses and this is the world we live in.
Right.
And this is necessary. And that's really interesting for someone who defends, bodily rights arguments as the justification for abortion, because she's saying, or he is like saying, there is no autumn that has this motivation to torture their baby. But most women who have abortions aren't going to the abortion clinic and thinking, I'm going to refuse the right of my resources to my fetus today, and I'm going to exercise my own bodily autonomy, and that's why I'm here, because I don't want this parasite in me anymore.
Yeah.
That is not what's going on for them. And so, like, in the real world, they're thinking, there's no way I can take care of this baby, and I don't have the money to provide for this baby, and I just can't do this. I need an out. Like that, I mean, every woman's story is different, but that's what's going on in many women's minds. I would say probably never has there been a woman that's at the abortion facility that's thinking, I can do anything I want with my body, and so let's get this thing out. Like, I really don't think that's what's going on for most women.
Yeah.
And that's not something they ever really consider. I don't know if you guys have ever had that come up in a conversation or something, but I just feel like that's not something that's talked about. And I'm okay with not talking about that and going in like the let's talk about moral philosophy territory and not talk about the like, just because this thing justifies it, but it's not in their minds, then therefore you're wrong. I don't think that's like where I need to go. But it's weird that it's like a accusation we get, but they don't consider it for themselves.
Yeah, I actually talked about this in a blog post I wrote a long time ago. It was like probably like 3 or 4 years ago, but I wrote an article. It's like 2 bad pro-life responses to bodily rights arguments. And I think one of them was, that's just weird, that can't happen, blah, blah, blah. That, you know, they don't understand thought experiments. And then the other one was, this is not why women choose to have abortions. And it's another kind of a rejection of a thought experiment. It's like, yeah, but you know, when Thompson writes, you know, the violinist, he's not saying this is like analogous to her intentions, like what is going through her mind as he goes through. She's trying to defend abortion rights. She's trying to say there is a moral justification for abortion based on this principle. And here's a whole bunch of interesting analogies that kind of are about that principle. And so it doesn't matter that like when Guttmacher has, you know, twice now surveyed women having abortions and kind of put together these tables. Here's all the reasons women said are like why they had the abortion. And they also had another version that there was like, here's like, it included like, what was the number one, like the most important reason? Like none of those are in Thompson's thought experiments, but like, it doesn't matter because the point is that Thompson is trying to say there is a way to justify abortion and here's how.
And I actually, now I remember that article, and that was really well explained by you. I like that you gave all of the different breakdown of the reasons. I mean, it's now dated because it was a couple years ago, but
to be fair, Guttmacher hasn't done that survey again since. So it's as up to date as we have data.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think you explained that really well. And so just as I feel like that's a bad pro-life response, it's also a bad pro-choice response to do the same thing to us.
Yep.
Totally agree. I think it's also kind of a change of subject, like at least the way that you framed it. And I might have misunderstood this. So clarify if I got it wrong, but like the saying, yeah, well, that's not the real world. In the real world, we need abortion. Now you're not arguing based on bodily rights. You're saying this is a necessity for whatever X, Y, and Z societal reason. And that's fine. You can make that argument, but now you're not arguing bodily rights. Right. That's not a bodily rights response. That's a change of subject. And I think it's important to track with when someone is making a response and they're on target or versus when they change the subject. For instance, similarly, if I say, man, like, it seems like you can't have any exceptions on abortion because you're justifying based on bodily rights. And they're like, yeah, well, it's not a person until 20 weeks. Okay, cool. Now we're on personhood, but that's not a bodily rights defense. And at that point, you're only defending abortion up to 20 weeks and you don't need bodily rights to defend it. Personhood is enough. And that's the function of your argument. So at this point, we've changed the argument. And similarly here, they're like, yeah, well, this isn't the real world. In the real world, man, look at all these situations in our society where women need abortion. Right. Fine. But now we're outside of bodily rights. You've abandoned bodily rights.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And I was saying like the we need abortion thing because that's just kind of the rhetoric I'm familiar with. And I slip into that. But but it is interesting because, you know, that happens in conversations. You'll be arguing it and they're very hardcore on the my body, my choice. And they're sticking there and they're biting the bullet on all these extreme things. But then when you kind of go and you pivot in the conversation, or they pivot more often in my cases, but they change the subject to, well, we need blah, 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 blah.
Right.
It's so interesting that's what's going on.
I think it comes from feeling defensive.
Yeah.
So that's my experience anyway, or my interpretation of my experiences. Steve Wagner had this kind of like running thought process for a while that I didn't fully agree with, but there's at least something there, which is that he felt like basically at the core, this is a while ago, so this might not represent Steve currently, but when he was playing around with, it's like at the core, people believe that it's not a personhood. They believe that the fetus isn't a person because of bodily rights, and they believe that you have bodily rights because it's not a person. And it's just this big circle. And I think that's not actually the case, but conversationally, it's so common. Like once they're stumped on personhood, yeah, but it's in her body,
right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're stumped on bodily rights, yeah, well, it's not a person. It's the reaction of being defensive, right. And now as Supreme Court stuff is happening, like, well, whether or not it's a person, whether or not it's moral, women are going to get killed in the back alleys, and mm-hmm. like it's a pivot because they're feeling defensive.
And it's so important for you as a pro-life person to be able to track with what's going on there, because it can feel like for the pro-choice person, it can feel like they're doing a really good job because they're running on this track, and it's like they're making progress because they keep on saying pro-choice mm-hmm. arguments,
and they didn't have to give any ground,
right? But actually, what's going on is they're on a loop. They're on a track. It's on a loop. Like it's not that hard to just spit out different kind of slogans and types of arguments that aren't actually responding to what the pro-life person said, but it's just like throwing out this sort of rhetorical thing. And you need to be able to mm-hmm. track with, okay, did they just change the categories of abortion arguments? And if so, like kind of narrate that, kind of explain that, and be able to just kind of expose what's going on there, because otherwise it's very rhetorically powerful. Mm-hmm. And it can be really overwhelming. If you're the pro-life person, it's like, geez, I can't ever get this person pinned down anymore. It's like, yeah, because they keep on like portaling to a totally different topic and not responding to it.
It's a rhetorical cheat. It's a cheat to be like, oh, well, but it's not a person. like to just change the subject and act like, okay, well, now I'm not giving any ground. No, you've run out of steam on this line of argument.
Right. And but you're bad because you haven't told me how you deal with back alley abortions. It's like, okay, well, I guess we're talking about that now.
Right.
So,
it's so hard because there's one thing when you're dealing with someone who is cheating and they know they're cheating and they're intentionally cheating. And then you're more often than not dealing with someone who's cheating, but they're unintentionally doing it because it's all pouring out and it's all coming out and they're really frustrated and you're trying to help them. Keep your heads up, you guys. It's really hard. Like that was one of the things I think that when I was first starting conversations and I didn't really know how to dialogue well, it was so hard to pin someone down and stick with it and try to track with all the things going on.
Right.
I think that like multitasking clarity thing is one of the hardest skills to develop. And I hope that with time, maybe we can come up with some more dialogue tips to help navigate that. But I think we do a pretty good job with something like the filler sentences video, and also like kind of the meta conversation comments really can help there.
Yeah. Takes a lot of practice.
Mm-hmm. So I'm glad we're talking about sovereign zone a little bit more in an extended version today. And while we're on the topic, I kind of want to take the opportunity to talk about a question that comes up a lot when we teach Sovereign Zone. It came up in the Equip for Life course members Facebook recently. And this is something along the lines of, what do you do in the conversation when you're talking about thalidomide and the person says, sure, let's say a woman can take thalidomide, but just as long as then she has an abortion.
Right.
Because I don't want babies being born with no arms or legs, and I don't want people to be disabled. There's like harm done to a future child when she takes thalidomide, and that's why I'm against it. That's why I think it should be regulated and restricted, not because I don't support bodily autonomy. Yeah. So
I think this is the best response. This is outside of like abandoning sovereign zone arguments altogether. Like I think this is the most clever kind of attempt to get out of the problem, and I've definitely heard it in a lot of speeches. I've heard it on campus.
I've heard it on campus a lot.
We definitely need to talk about this.
And Tim does an excellent job responding to this in the Autumn paper, because like I said before, the fact that you do it in the context of a story, you're able to have Autumn kind of think through, well, I don't know about this. And you do a good job at that, but can you kind of recap and elaborate on that point?
So first off, it's worth clarifying, and I don't always do this, but I would like to always do this. It's worth clarifying. So if she wants to take the thalidomide and she doesn't intend to have an abortion, you don't think she should have the right to do that. Is that correct?
And the pro-choice person would say yes in this case, right?
And typically the way that this comes up, they're like, well, she can take thalidomide if then she has an abortion, and they don't clarify that last part. It's kind of implied, and I don't like implications and ambiguity. let's just get that clear. And then everything comes down to this question: why is it worse for her to take thalidomide and not abort the baby than it is to abort the baby. Why is it? What is the like the moral justification here? What makes it so much worse for this baby to be alive and disabled than to just be killed in an abortion? And that always comes down to basically the same type of premise. It often takes a few clarification questions to get here because they're not even sure what's going on in their mind. They just kind of feel this thing and they don't articulate it.
It's a great point.
But after you ask a few clarification questions, every conversation, it has always come down to the same basic premise.
Yes.
Which is it's worse to torture people than it is to kill them. Which is kind of intuitive, right? Like,
yeah.
Well, it's worse to disable people in this case than to kill them.
I'm getting there.
Okay.
Which is that it's worse to torture people than it is to kill them. And or something like that.
Yeah. And
that's kind of intuitive. Like, man, like if I was being tortured, like, man, I'd rather just die real quick.
Right.
In this case, there's kind of a conflation that's happened here between something like being tortured and being maimed or being disabled.
Yeah.
And like most disabled people don't kill themselves.
Yeah.
But for abled people, you could even argue this is kind of an ableist argument. I'm not actually sure if I believe that, but maybe it is. There's a like, well, surely it would be just worse to be dead. I mean, that is pretty ableist, isn't it? I've never thought about it like that.
I think
it is.
I think
that's legit ableist.
That's a clever one-line response. That's a real ableist argument you just made.
Maybe. So again, that happened just in this podcast.
Yeah.
And you heard it here, and we haven't tried it. We haven't tried it on campus yet. So I'm always a little bit wary of saying, "Oh, do this thing" if we haven't experimented with it. But that's potentially actually a very powerful response. So we'll try that next time on campus. But what I've done is I've expressed that it seems like what you're saying is that it's worse for them to be disabled than to even be alive with a disability. And so then the question is, what should we do with disabled people? What should we do with disabled newborns? And the answer to that question, there's only one answer to that question. If you're making this kind of a response, you say we kill them because it's worse for them to be alive. Like we're doing them a favor. We're doing them a favor to kill them in the same way that if you take thalidomide, you're doing them a favor if you abort them. And then if that's true, you have no explanation for what to do with people that are disabled. You kill them all. And I have talked to people on campus that basically bite that bullet too. Only a couple.
Scary.
That's that's unusual, but it's happened. Where like they have a very like, man, you know, I've maybe like they had a sibling that was disabled or something. Like, man, I saw them and their life is really hard. I wouldn't want that for anybody. And like to them, it feels compassionate. It doesn't feel ableist. It feels compassionate. It's like the world is it's going to be a better place. And like, if I would rather be dead. It's kind of like where it's coming from. It's like, if it was me, I would rather be dead. And so golden rule. So therefore I'm being gracious and compassionate to everyone else. But it's really, really wrong. And so most of the time people won't bite that bullet and then that kind of ends that issue. But even then, like, I think sometimes people struggle with like the intuitive part of that because you've got to get them from the, well, it's okay if she takes thalidomide, then she's going to have an abortion to what the principle is. And I think that's a hard connection for people. That is what it comes down to. But sometimes people don't see that as easily. So sometimes you got to walk them through that a couple times.
I want to hear you respond to what I think would be like a natural attempt for the pro-choice person to wriggle out of this. I don't think there'd be a successful way to wriggle out of it, but I could totally see someone doing this. Maybe I've experienced this before. I'm not sure, or I might just be improving here, but I'll kind of try to role play like this attempt and just let you kind of demonstrate how you'd respond to it. It'd be something like, okay, so I'm not so extreme that I would say like disabled people should all be killed. That's like not my view. I'm totally not ableist. I'm just saying that like the only reason in this thought experiment that the person would be disabled is if the mom took thalidomide. And so I feel like if she takes thalidomide to help her morning sickness because she's got to wait like a week before she has the abortion and that she's already scheduled. Maybe she's in one of these crazy pro-life states that makes them wait around. And so she's got terrible morning sickness. So she takes thalidomide then. Like, I just don't care because I think effectively it's like, it's just not doing anything. But I would definitely be opposed to a woman taking thalidomide and then like not having the abortion because then like she's caused harm at this point. I don't think it harms an embryo if an embryo is aborted even a week or two after thalidomide. But I do think that like if the baby's going to be born and it can either be born perfectly healthy or born with, you know, significant disability because the mom chose to take thalidomide, I have a problem with that.
So I would ask a clarification question. So if you don't mind, just kind of role playing a little bit. So yeah, let's imagine that the woman is in one of these terrible pro-life states, and it's so terrible that she takes the thalidomide. She has morning sickness. She's doing this whole waiting period.
Yep.
And then she gets to the clinic, and there's like a really nice sidewalk counselor named Jacob. And Jacob talks to her.
Hypothetically.
They have a great conversation. And now she decides she actually doesn't want to have the abortion. And so let's say she's going to walk away from the clinic. She's already taken thalidomide. Is that wrong for her to do? Or is it the only moral choice in this situation now is for her to go through with the original decision that she thought she was going to make?
I hadn't thought of that before. Like honestly, I think I'm out of the improv now. I'm like, it just depends on the pro-choice person and how stubborn they are. Like I feel like that person could go either way, but I think that was an awesome thought experiment.
Yeah,
okay.
I think that was good. I think it's just a general reminder here. So I think the direction that I would have gone with you, Josh, is to remind you what we're arguing, because sometimes at this point, because like honestly, and that's not like I mean insultingly, in these conversations, people they're thinking about the argument and they forgot why the argument's there,
right?
And they kind of like deviate from it. It's like so just for clarification, do you think that we should restrict her in any circumstance from taking thalidomide? Because if so, then it kind of seems like my body, my choice isn't there anymore. Like, should she have the legal right to do this?
Right.
If you say no, then it doesn't seem like you actually believe that women have the right to do anything they want with anything inside their bodies. And sometimes you've got to narrate that a couple times,
right? Because
we make an argument like the thalidomide argument or the fetal torture story, and all of a sudden like, oh, okay, we're arguing about the argument. We forgot why the argument's there. And all I care about is you abandon the sovereign zone view. I don't care how much you like my argument. I don't care. I want you to have to abandon the view that you can do anything you want with anything inside your body, and that's the point of all the arguments.
Right. I'm trying to think like how would I role play the pro-choice person responding to that? I'm just like, I end up in this place of being like super ad hoc. Like, well, see, is her body, she can do anything she wants except for taking thalidomide if she's not going to have the abortion, like something like that.
So
flag on the field, philosophy flag on the field.
But like, I think it's actually easier with Josh's pro-choice person for them to track with my method, because when I ask that question, I'm going to circle it back and I'm going to tie a bow on it. And I'm going to say, so if now we're saying the only moral choice for her is for her to go through with the abortion, it's almost like now we're restricting, what she can do with her body. Now all she can do morally or maybe even legally, there's like some sort of restriction that if you've taken thalidomide, you have to have an abortion. Yeah. That seems like
which
really
starts
extreme.
Feeling a little Handmaid's Tale-y.
It's a little Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah.
So there's some different things that we're doing here that I think are both very valuable and important. When Josh was expressing his view, it just really reminded me of people that have lost track of the argument.
That's totally
not
true.
sure if that was the case or not. So stylistically speaking, I don't have a strong view. These are both directions that are worth going, and it's judgment call what you want to do first, how you want to do it. But certainly, if there's a situation where it seems like the person's lost the argument, that's very easy to do, particularly in the sovereign zone territory, because you end up with a thought experiment. We're arguing about the thought experiment, and they lose track of why we're arguing about the thought experiment. I'm not trying to disprove all of abortion. I'm trying to beat the sovereign zone view.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I think that's totally fair to point out, because certainly this thing is a pivot from your original conversation. And I think it's good to point that out.